Good afternoon. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Friday, March 21st, 2025. We are continuing our tour of the FY26 budget and some language. And we have this afternoon a conversation about the section around budgets and the Joint Fiscal Committee and Emergency Board and Authority, given the world that we seem to be living in now, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen. So we have with us the Chair of House Ways and Means, Emily Kornheiser, Representative Kornheiser, and Brandon Hare from Legislative Council. So thank you very much. I think this should be on our committee page now, if you all want to find it there. And if you guys want to introduce yourselves and take it away, that'd be great.
Thanks. Hi, I am Emily Kornheiser, representative from Brattleboro. I'm here as the chair of the Joint Fiscal Committee. That's sort of the hat I'm wearing today, rather than the chair of the Ways and Means Committee. And I'm here with
Brandon Hare, Director and Chief Counsel, Legislative Council.
and I think you all.
It's going to be to refresh. But yes, it is. There we go. Okay, it's there under Bryn's name.
I think you all know probably more than most folks in this building the tremendous fiscal instability that we are operating in right now. And I want to be sure that when we leave this building, we are able to be flexible and responsive and be aligned with legislative intent in case anything comes up, such as drastic reductions in federal spending. And that could be something that we're expecting, such as a drastic reduction in Medicaid dollars, but it could be something unexpected. And as I'm sure you all know, some departments might have much smaller budgets, but a much higher dependence on federal dollars. And some departments might be much larger with a smaller percentage of reliance on federal dollars, but a really enormous dollar amount that we're talking about. And so want to make sure that the authority of the Joint Fiscal Committee and the Emergency Board is responsive to both of those scenarios in a reduction in federal spending. Right now, the authority of Joint Fiscal and the E-Board is really designed around recessionary environments, which we also might be moving into.
Yes.
But not as responsive to massive changes in federal obligations. And so that is what we are trying to adjust our language towards. In developing this, I've talked to your own chair, been working with staff, as well as working with the treasurer's office a little bit to make sure we're not doing anything to mess with our credit ratings as well. Well, stop there. That's the thinking behind this.
Okay. Great.
It'd be helpful if I started a walkthrough of the language.
Yes, I think that would be great. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so the first section and the section titles are just sort of placeholders at this point until the decision is made to embed the language in the actual budget bill. So the first section right now, titled A101A, is a legislative intent section. So this would be some session law that's put forth to establish legislative intent, to provide some guidance around the actions of the Joint Fiscal Committee or the Emergency Board when the General Assembly is not in session. So if there is a reduction in funding sources, an action has to be taken before the General Assembly can reconvene. This is language that would guide any action of those two bodies to act in the interim. Essentially to set forth the intent of the General Assembly and what your priorities are in making any decisions in the event there's a reduction in funding that impacts the budget. So that is the first section. Second section, this is the statute that guides what happens during the off session if there's any budget or appropriation adjustments that needs to be made. So if you turn to the second page where you see some new language in subdivision 3.
So this is already in statute. We
Yes.
do have language in statute, but we
Exactly.
have joint fiscal.
Yes, this statute governs the rescission plan authority, and this essentially provides that under certain circumstances, Joint Fiscal Committee is authorized, working in conjunction with the Secretary of Administration, to engage in like an expenditure reduction process when the General Assembly is not in session, to avoid a deficit when revenues of the general fund or transportation fund or federal funds fall short of where the official state revenue estimates are. So the new language,
Maybe I'm on the wrong section. I'm on the bottom of page 2.
Which is
Yeah.
in each instance.
Yeah, that's where I am.
yep, you're in the right place. So
But it says the reduction of federal funds results in a 1% more to support an appropriation.
that's right. So this is new language in that statute. It sets out a different sort of trigger clause or a different set of circumstances that authorizes the Joint Fiscal Committee to act. So this provides, just as you said, in any instance where the reduction in federal funds has the result of reducing in a 1% or more reduction in the total funds available to support an appropriation.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. And I understand, 1% of the whole budget is a big number. 1% in a department or an agency or a sub part of that, may not be a big item. So, for example, let's just say the local foods grant in ag or wherever, education, wherever it lies. If that reduction came in July after we adjourned, does that mean Joint Fiscal Committee for that 1.7 million, because that'd be more than 1% of that appropriation, I would assume, had to come back and deal with that?
Does not have to.
But, good.
We'll get, I promise we'll get.
All right, I don't mean to, I don't understand, I don't need to be a real.
No.
Every week.
I have no interest in doing that. Representative Harris.
Yes.
A whole life.
I love driving up.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So here's what can happen in the event.
You have a question?
Yeah. I was just wondering, how was the 1% chosen? Some formula or some calculations? What's magical about 1%?
I went through various scenarios with the Joint Fiscal Office to really try to get at just the situation I was describing in my introduction, that we might have an appropriation with a very significant budget that 1% would be enough we would really need to act on. And we might have a department that had an enormous amount of federal funding that just kept its lights on, right? And so tried to find something that was balancing the two of those.
Okay, let's continue because maybe the rest of the picture will become clearer as we actually hear the whole thing.
So in the event of that trigger that we just described, here are the different outcomes that could come to pass. The first is that the Secretary of Administration shall plan and prepare an expenditure reduction plan for approval by the Joint Fiscal Committee, just as that authority exists in the subsection B1 and B2 above, which is when there is a 1% or more reduction in funds. The second provision is on the third page, subdivision B. In order to maintain a balanced state budget, minimize the impact of Vermonters, and abide by the legislative intent that's set forth by the General Assembly in the most recent Fiscal Year Appropriations Act, and that refers back to that legislative intent language that we talked about at the outset. The Joint Fiscal Committee may make recommendations to the Emergency Board, and here are the recommendations that they may make underneath subsection B. They can recommend to utilize rainy day funds to support any impacted programs at no more than the current fiscal year funding level until the General Assembly is in session. They can recommend to the E-Board to revert any unexpended or unobligated funds and abolish any spending authority, or both. And they can recommend to the E-Board to make such reductions in appropriations as necessary to support the priorities of the General Assembly. And the recommended reduction is limited to no more than 10% of any fund or 10% of any appropriation.
So the general fund balance reserve is the rainy day fund, which is different from our stabilization reserve fund. And this is a fund that doesn't have a maximum. I mean, there's a statutory maximum, I think, on the other percentage, but this one does not. And it's also a place where we can put things for situations and we can pull it out, and it doesn't always have to be for dire situations either. We have access to those funds, so it's kind of the safe place to park the money, and it doesn't come out unless the General Assembly, if I'm understanding it correctly, unless the General Assembly chooses to take it out.
That's right. Okay. So we'll move on to the next section. Described here as section Y. So this 32 VSA 133, these are the duties of the emergency board. And the change here would allow the emergency board to draw on that rainy day fund to make expenditures necessitated by unforeseen emergencies. So it essentially expands what they can draw on in that event. Next section, described as subsection or section Z. Now this is, there is one change in 308CA, which increases the percentage of the appropriations from the general fund that goes to the general fund balance reserve from 5% to 10%.
And that's of the general funds money that is in the budget. So if we have an $8.5 billion budget, a whole lot of that's federal funds.
Right.
So is it 10% of general fund?
Right, appropriations from the general fund from the prior fiscal year.
Absorbing this.
And then if you go down to the bottom of the page, this is subsection B1. And this is language that provides that should an emergency occur, the General Assembly has access to funds, even if no rainy day funds were added to the reserve in the prior fiscal year.
Can you show, I'm not sure where you are now.
So I'm still in section Z, subdivision B1.
Oh, next to it. Oh, yes, okay.
Right, so it provides that the GA can unreserve and appropriate an amount not to exceed 5% from the rainy day fund to fund unforeseen emergency needs. And then there's another sentence, new sentence after that, that provides the intent of the General Assembly is to replenish the rainy day fund.
So, let's just say we park an extra $100 million there in this wonderful world that we can manage to do that. That's a whole lot more than what's necessary to keep in there. If we park that, would it be our intent to replenish it with the same 100 million if it's already up to what it is?
It's an intent to replenish. It's not a requirement to replenish. And I think that helps the folks watching our credit rating know that we're feeling very responsible about our reserves.
Okay.
But we are not,
Audience, okay.
we are not required to do that immediately upon, reconvening as a body, anything like that.
Yeah. John?
That was kind of my question. There's no end date by which that must happen, but to work towards it.
Tom, is your impression?
Not yet.
Okay.
And I just sort of, I feel like I wasn't clear enough in my intent when I first described sort of what we were imagining here. Is okay if I take a brief moment to
Please.
So essentially, right now, the e-board has a lot of authority to transfer money around. It's expanding sort of the amount of dollars of that slightly, and really asking the Joint Fiscal Committee to be paying attention to that and advising on that. So the e-board's not making those decisions in isolation. That's essentially it. So the e-board is maintaining the authority of being able to move the dollars. It's not giving that new power to the Joint Fiscal Committee, but it's really trying to involve the Joint Fiscal Committee, which is a lot more members than, the five of us that sit on the e-board. So that we can have the wisdom of the folks on the Joint Fiscal Committee as where the e-board is making decisions in an emergency. In other times, we might be doing that informally by just calling around before an e-board meeting. It would be nice to do it a little more formally.
Okay, Tom?
And I'm sorry, I might have missed the beginning of this. Is this required? What triggers this in the first place? Is there a state of emergency that gets called? Is there a state of fiscal emergency that gets called?
None of it's required. It's just possible.
And so.
Bridget should answer that question, not me. Sorry.
It's true. And when we talk about the next subsection, the trigger will become more clear.
And so. All right, I'll keep going.
So.
No, I'm just, I understand the intent here. I'm just wondering, and it may just to me, I know the 1% applies across the board, whether it's federal or general fund, that there's a 1% reduction now in our revenues, and it isn't, as Emily said, intended for recession. All of a sudden, the tax receipts are down, and we have the ability to adopt a plan by the governor or the administration for fixing that. Okay. And I realized with the federal fund concern that we may have areas of government, like the Department of Labor, for example. I mean, they get a lot of federal funding. It's a big part of their budget. And we want to, but it may not be 1% of the total, okay? But it still impacts them, and we need the Department of Labor, especially if there is a recession. So I get all that. I'm just not sure the same 1% is applicable to that. Maybe it's a 10, I don't know, I'm thinking out loud. Maybe it's a 10% level of their total appropriation. I'm thinking of the Council on Arts, for example. It wouldn't take much, to trigger a 1%.
Or the libraries who are
The
already
library,
hit.
yeah. So I'm just wondering if, and I know we don't have to act on it, but for everyone, someone's got to come from the administration's got to come up with a plan to address that $50 shortfall because it's over 1%.
I think the concern is that it's possible, and again, it's really hard to prepare for an absolutely unforeseen circumstance. And so we're doing our best to prepare for an unforeseen circumstance. I think one of the scenarios that is trying to be prepared for in here is there's the one scenario that's sort of very straightforward, right? The Medicaid dollars. I think we all talk about that. There's the other scenario, the Department of Labor is the example that I've used over and over. Thank you. And that one's very sort of manageable. There's the other scenario where it's sort of a 1,000 cuts situation. And we're seeing small reductions in various places, and we're backfilling them because there's small reductions in various places. The administration's just sort of transferring money to be responsible as small cuts take place. And we're not monitoring that constant series of small cuts. And I think we want to be, because they're going to add up fairly quickly, and they could add up in a really significant way by the time we get back here. And so, yes, I don't think that if the Department of, Libraries loses, 1% of their budget, necessarily we're going to want to convene the e-board or the General Assembly, but it's certainly something I think we want to be tracking because they add
I
up.
know, but if I'm reading this language, someone's required to come up with a plan to address that 1% in the Department of the Library. And I'm not picking on the library, but in the scheme of things, it's a small agency.
Doesn't take much to get to 1%.
And so what I would imagine would happen in that scenario is, given this structure, that the administration would come up with a system for us to be doing this regular reporting with each other, the same way that we get updates on other things, the same way we sort of, were tracking FEMA spending in a very specific way. It wasn't like they were giving us a brand new, 20-page report every day. It's that we had a tracker that was getting updated, and we called that tracker a plan. It doesn't need to be a strategic plan with like a, fancy cover on it. It's that we're in constant consultation about this, and we're being regularly updated on what happens when this reduction takes place.
I appreciate all that. I'm just questioning the 1% being too small. I don't know, 10% or 5% is the number.
Okay, I've got Lynn, Wayne, and John.
Okay, my memory serves me correctly, somewhere maybe the 90s or maybe the early 2000s, we went through some sort of recession, sort of recessionary period. Part of the thing that happened is that the government was making decisions on these things alone. And then the board was created with these 4 other people.
Right.
But the Joint Fiscal Office was always involved, always met, and they always said. But it basically came down to, and I'm just sort of wondering if this is really all that different. It basically came down to time to go, and if you had we had rescissions. The day I was here, probably here for the first 4 or 5 years, we had rescissions every summer. We'd have a balanced budget 30th, and then we had rescissions by July 15th. And then the E-board came in with the governor and they met and they looked at what they had. They gave the advice of the legislature, and the intent was to include the legislature in these decisions. So that when cuts were made, because they were cuts, you know. Where did you do it? How do you do it? How did it beat the inflation? I'm not sure that this is any different from that, except that we're looking maybe at something much grander and more, much larger. Is that correct?
I absolutely
Yeah.
agree, yeah.
Okay, so what we've sort of always done, haven't done it recently probably, but we've always done a similar thing to this. I'm kind of lost you along the way, and maybe Gwen, you can help me with this. When we got, you have the 1%, and then there's a thing in Z that talks about the 10%. No, I'm just trying to figure out the rainy day. The rainy day is in BI, little I on page 3. Top, and then you're in Y, and then you've got the general fund balance reserves. Is that all of them, or just rainy day, or how does that work?
For section Z, the 10%?
Well, the 10% is down here, yes, and it goes from 5 to 10%. Can you explain? You said it shall not exceed 10% of the appropriations from the general fund. We've already got those. I mean, that's something that's already being done at 5%.
5%, right.
And now you're changing it to 10, but we're not going to be putting reserves in. We're just going to be, to rebound. I'm sort of not really following that whole section.
Yeah.
Can you just explain it more clearly, please?
So what Z does is just changes the amount from 5% to 10%. So everything about it stays the same, but it just provides that what the reserve is 10% of the appropriations from the general fund.
Is that for this today, for this current situation, or is that something going forward?
It's going forward,
So in the future, after we get through this crisis,
right?
we are going to want to put away 10%.
It would take effect at the same time the other sections would take effect, so it would apply moving forward
Oh, yeah.
unless you wanted to change it back.
So right now we're doing 5. So
Right, exactly.
That's what we're dealing with.
Right.
5. Okay.
This would take effect July 1st this year. So it would be
If we
next
have money to
year.
do it.
Right, well, and if we have, this is sort of the place to park funds. Emily, would you like to say something?
Yeah, and just to clarify, right, so there's 2 reserves in the general. There's the balance reserve, which is the one we're talking about here, and there's the stabilization fund.
Yeah.
The stabilization fund is the one I think you're thinking of that we always fill to 5%.
Right.
The balance reserve, the goal is to get it to 5%, which is what's in the statute right now, but it is not at 5% yet. And so this would, and that one, it's not required to be at 5% in the fiscal year. So this would just like that secondary one,
That's the
which
judge.
the goal has been 5%, the goal would be increased to 10%.
Because that's how we can use it as a place
Yes.
to park
We
money.
could park
If
money
we,
in there.
right,
We
the
have-
purpose is to park money in case we need it because Washington blows up.
It's trying to figure out.
All right, wait,
Thank you.
We're back on Jim's concern on the 1%. Where you're gonna depend on the governor's office to tell you whether it's been a 1% decrease. That's not very much in federal money. And if it was scattered across different departments, you could say 10,000 out of it. You might be triggering this board to have to act, all the time. And so I just wonder if you really think it's reasonable, or are you gonna wait till the governor comes up with a whole bunch of 1%, or?
We don't have to act, and the Joint Fiscal Committee doesn't even have to act. We just
No,
need to be, informed. And so would probably, and the E-board, this last summer and the summer before it met regularly to take really quick action on flood relief. And did it somewhat in isolation. And so part of what I'm looking for here is for the E-board to actually just get more formal advice from more of our colleagues, including Representative Harrison. And then the other piece is that, yes, we would likely, the same way we wait for a number of grants to pile up before we meet, we would wait for a number of pieces to come together before we met, because we all have lives to live. And there are times where I've sort of, certain appropriations that we were not tracking during the off session, sometimes, we hear about them too late to do something about it. And so wanted to make sure that we were tracking it in time to be able to, be responsive if we need to, right?
So just to follow up here too, not to get too deep in the weeds here with this, but if it were a relatively small amount, but still having a big impact on a department or agency here for sure. You know, some of those things may require a pretty definitive plan on how to address that. Others just might require an action. So we're informed about that action. That's what I assume would probably happen. Yes.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
Okay. Other questions? Wayne, do you have another question?
I mean, sometimes agencies go over budget on things, and that's why we come back to BA to deal with some of those things. And on those small things like that, again, I'm just concerned that the trigger might just cause you more trouble than it's worth, to have it that low. But that's, if you're gonna do it, then I'm.
But I do think it's important to be tracking,
Or sure.
and I don't think anybody wants to spend time unnecessarily working on this. You know, if we don't need to be all called in.
More than likely, when we have the problem, it's probably not gonna be 1%.
Exactly. Jim?
I would just say, I mean, we talked about adding some kind of language at the beginning of the session. I think it's very important in light of the uncertainty to do something, because you can have a 0.5% reduction in the total budget, but 20% of it's in an area that's going to definitely impact. And I use the Department of Labor because that's something during hard times you got to keep up and going. So I totally get that. I just think the 1% is too small in the individual areas. And I know your intent's not to bring us back, but I just think that's too small.
I could,
Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10%. I don't know.
so I think maybe I don't think that this is gonna be a problem and a solution just this session.
Yeah.
And so I imagine if this summer we feel like we are receiving more communication than we're able to process, we could come back and adjust the threshold next session.
Right.
And I'll tell you personally, every time I need to come up here for a meeting during the summer, it's like that much harder for me to pay my mortgage. So I would, I promise you, I will not call us together unless we absolutely must come together. But I think it's important to stay informed.
I just 1% in some budgets is nothing.
And so we won't meet.
I mean,
I know, but I don't know. I just think it's almost too. It's me.
No, and there's the funny thing, sometimes we approve grants for $10,000, and it's, that also feels very funny to me, but it's part of our process, right? We just don't do it. We don't have a single meeting to approve a grant for $10,000.
we gotten through the whole bill?
I have one more.
Okay, let's do that.
So the last piece is subdivision 3 on the last page, or the second to last page. And this is language that just allows the emergency board, under certain circumstances, to hold state agencies and departments harmless, or reduce the burden on their operating budgets for responding to these certain criteria. So the certain criteria, the triggers here are, this will sound familiar. First is the any declared emergency pursuant to statute while the General Assembly is not in session, a reduction in state revenue estimates pursuant to that section of law we were talking about earlier, or a reduction in federal funding pursuant to that section we were talking about earlier. So any of those three things occurring while the General Assembly is not in session would allow the E-Board to utilize some of the rainy day funds to make those impacted agencies, departments, programs whole, to maintain a balanced state budget, minimize the impact of Vermonters, and abide by the legislative intent set forth in that first section that we talked about. So those are the sort of guidelines around how the E-Board can make those decisions. And also that last sentence there provides that it prohibits the E-Board from providing any agency or department an amount exceeding the original appropriation as set forth by the General Assembly.
Um, my brain gets revved up and I want to go into scenario planning, and I don't think that this is the time or place for it, but it is the idea here of what are the facts of the rainy day fund today? Like, so using today's news of this would cost X amount of millions of dollars for education, our educational system. How many reserves do we actually have that are available for, I mean, this to me would be saying that this is an extremely rainy day, more than any other rainy days that we've ever experienced before, because we're taking upwards of, in a scenario, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that go away. What would be an expectation of how much could actually be covered with the rainy day fund through the reserves that are able to be used on an emergency basis?
I think that's a better question for Emily. What I would say is we're expanding where the e-board right now can only transfer money essentially. And so we're sort of expanding where the e-board can transfer money from. But the scale of things, I'll defer to the other Emily on. And just really want to state very clearly that if things get more extreme than as imagined in this language, we're going to need to reconvene and you all are going to need to rewrite the budget. So,
We will be back.
so I just want like, you know, this is a stopgap measure between those two, right?
So Emily Burke, the Joint Fiscal Office, so projected at the end of FY 25 is about $98 million in the rainy day reserve, which is the reserve we're talking about, so 5% of that is about $5 million, 10% is about $10 million.
Wow, we're dropping the bucket.
Yeah.
And I'd love to be able to spend the next 3 days doing scenario planning, but
That on your own time, Tom, you can.
that's 2:00 in the morning.
Yeah. So any other questions for these folks you can think of? All right. Why don't we noodle on that for a little bit? It's the proposal, we need to get it in the budget language, that's the plan. But we want to have a little chance to think about it. So I really appreciate you all coming down and chatting with us.
Nice. And I'll be in the building for maybe not as many hours as you will be, but a number more hours. So
Okay.
touch it to you.
Great. All right. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Okay. Aaron, I'm checking the agenda. Do we have anybody coming in to visit us again? Emily, where's Grady at this point?
Yes.
Let's see.
Okay.